Welcome to the March 23rd School Committee's Curriculum Subcommittee meeting. We will be recording this meeting so that members of the community can also watch this at another time if they're not able to join us today. The first thing we have on our agenda is to approve the minutes from the March 16th meeting. Has everyone had an opportunity to review those, and would anyone like to make a motion?
I will move it.
I will. Okay, great. We'll take a roll call vote. Helen?
Yes.
Susan?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes, and hopefully Ms. Scotto will be joining us shortly. The second item on our agenda is our panel one presentation. So I'd just like to thank all of our panel members for coming and joining us today and sharing their presentations. I want to thank everyone for all of their hard work over this really stressful period of time and for working with us. And we're really excited to have all three panels. We have 30 minutes allotted for each one. So we were hoping for a presentation period and a question and answer period. And so I would love to introduce our panel one presentation. Kanan McKenzie is going to be so generously coming to join us today to share, because she is no longer, if I understand correctly, living in Brookline, but is going to share the work and is very familiar with the work and was integral to that process. And so we really appreciate you coming back and joining us today to share with us. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. I owe you all a deep debt of gratitude as well, because I'm actually on school committee in my new town. In Beverly. And I think that had I not had this experience, I wouldn't have the courage to do that, because I wouldn't have known what was involved. And I had such great mentoring from Susan with that. So I think that was very encouraging to me. So it's nice to see everybody again and to be able to really reflect back on our previous work that we did with the panel. I want to just acknowledge our panel members, some of whom are on the call today. Sarah Whitman, Lisa Wisman-Whale, Miriam Fine, Lisa Gurdon was my co-chair, Adria Gross, Igor Golger, Ilya Rifkin, Lygia Lee, Ola Ozornov Palchik, Shahar Abramovich, and we were, of course, ably led by Susan and Sharon Abramowitz before she was off the committee. So we had a lot of good support there. And as many of you already know, the way that the procedure was essentially rolled out is that we applied to be members of this expert advisory panel of parents, which was a really great opportunity to serve. And initially, we were all thinking perhaps school was going to be rounding the bend maybe that summer, and things kept shifting very rapidly. So initially we were assigned to work with Dr. Gittens, and her role essentially became full with other pressing things. And then we were essentially matched with Dr. Warnham, who then went on a leave. So finally we were able to work with Meg, who's on the call now, and she was amazing. I know that she's now with RLA, but we were able to finally sort of, get the wheels rolling and talk about what our focus areas would be as a panel. So although we were the Equity and Excellence panel, we decided that it would be better to break out some of those things into focus areas. And then within our group of about 12 people, we either had more than one area of focus or we had a particular area. So what I wanted to share first is just an idea of how we decided to look at those focus areas and how we describe them. And then from there, we started to develop some thinking and some, feedback and strategy around that. So I'm going to try to share my screen here so you can see that. So here it just says panel one, focus areas, right? We had we essentially talked about remote learning and hybrid learning almost exclusively, because at the time, those were the only options that we really could consider. Part one is we looked at educational practices that were going to promote learning in a universal design methodology, which meant we were looking at supports that considered the remote and hybrid nature of this new experience for students. So UDL came up, and we also talked about whether or not we wanted to look at students with IEPs and 504 plans. We also talked about the ways that we would need to differentiate with remote learning to maximize student engagement. So again, we looked at what does this mean if you're looking at ELL students, vulnerable populations, and those who essentially would need accommodations that would be difficult to navigate potentially from home. And third, we talked about the need for consistency that we noticed was certainly a challenge, not just for Brookline, but in lots of places, but trying to see how to create some clarity in scheduling and instruction and just information in general, so that there was more assistance to caregivers who then had to utilize this information to help students. And then finally, we wanted to talk about communication strategies and how to build relationships as a result of a good communication strategy. So that would include looking at multiple ways to communicate. We talked about multiple languages, multiple ways to do that, and how that information would flow from communicating with teachers, but also administration, central office, and such. So this was essentially driving a lot of our initial conversations. And then from there, throughout the summer, we talked about how to present that in a way that was easy to understand. So what I have for the latter part of this is we developed these presentations as subgroups within the Equity and Excellence panel. So before I share those, is anyone else on the call in panel 1, do they want to expand on anything that I have said around our focus areas? I see Sarah, I see Lydia. Do either of you want to add anything to what I just said?
Not at this time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So with that, next I want to give you an example of 2 presentations we did, not because the others weren't great, but because there were different formats, and these seem to be the 2 that were easier to present fairly quickly in this meeting. So we had sections 3 and 4 out of our panel. So those 4 areas that I showed you, these are the 3 of those areas. So let me pull that up, and then I'll share the screen with you on focus area 3. Okay, so in focus area 3, you can see who is listed here as participating on this. And essentially what this area was considered is the connection between community members, caregivers, and being able to give that clear guidance. Our hope was that by giving that clear guidance, we would promote more equity and access to information. It could be the case that, part of it was the changing nature of the instructions and scheduling, because it was a hybrid situation for many students. And so we really wanted to think about how having consistent information would help forge what we thought would be greater and better relationships where parents were truly going to be seen as partners in this experience. And so we developed some considerations. We also looked at the survey that was sent out from the district to see if we could pull from that information about what would work best to communicate that information. For example, we noted that the survey data indicated that there were disparities in how children were to access their academic information. We had differences in formatting and in software and in just different things that teachers were using initially. And that the involvement across the grade levels varied depending on, the types of information one would have. And so the ease of accessing that varied among parents greatly. So one of the things we had talked about was how to create a hub or how to create super easy ways to access information. We talked about the types of things we would recommend, which were parents, again, going to centralized places for information, sending calendar invitations to access Zoom links versus navigating different ways to find those links. We also talked about preparing parents for the week, where they would have ways to have a concentrated information in one place for each of their children. And then finally, whether there could be an exit ticket of sorts at the end of the week to find out how families had done, to see what work was completed for students. And so families just had a better understanding of what was completed and what was not. We also wanted to highlight the use of early warning indicators for no-shows or missing work, and also whether if there were social emotional concerns that either families had or teachers noticed when students were in person. We also liked the idea of the survey and wanted to see if a monthly survey would be helpful to continue to gauge how students were doing. We used some of the state recommended resources for families to create this greater sense of bridging. And so we talked about how to have these collaborative conversations using DESE's Family Engagement Toolkit or the Family Engagement Framework from DESE. Another area of concern was whether or not we could scaffold the information to make sure it was developmentally appropriate in the ways that we were able to communicate with families about learning. And so we were looking at the different platforms, for example, that students were going to use and whether it was age appropriate. So we looked at Seesaw, Google, and Canvas and considered the ways that parents might be educated about those and how, sort of what were the things about those different platforms that could be amplified in ways that were useful to families. We also, again, just talked about the early warning indicator system for percentage of work that was completed, and if there was a way to give parents and families access to that, trying to see if there was a way to do that. And to my knowledge, there wasn't, but I'll be happy to hear what any updates are that have happened. We referred again to some of the equitable and accessible resources for families that we thought we knew about, which was again looking at a consistent centralized hub for information, streamlining of coursework for everyone. I don't know if you could see the bottom of this without me moving pages. But again, essentially ensuring that families had an easy way to access resources and information. So that's a little bit of that as well. We talked about some of the hubs that we liked and we highlighted those. So there were a few within district that we wanted to make available for either replicating or modeling. That included looking at Driscoll and Runkle. And we also gave an example in several pages about what we thought was working well. And seeing if that could be incorporated and again replicated. So that was more of these pages. And then it ended with an example of a potential resource to look at an equity tool to look at issues and what the solutions were, and then how we would determine who in the district would be the contact person to address that issue. We also gave some more resources with regard to engagement strategies, in hopes that as we were developing some of this thinking, it would be incorporated as well. So that was the panel portion that looked at community engagement. And then a final focus area that has a really quick presentation that I can share with you is from our fourth focus area. And that was on, sorry about that, won't move. This is on essentially the communication strategy overall as a district. So in this instance, we were talking about how to adequately communicate with families using different approaches. We wanted to continue to emphasize the need for a feedback loop and in ways that were looking at the different assets in the community, like the principal, site councils, the district having a monthly feedback system, and other ways that various parts of the community and different stakeholders could share how things were going. We also thought there could be some variation in terms of using video, newsletters, and like a monthly sort of umbrella approach where we had a state of the district kind of communication. We also wanted to talk about whether there could be workshops and webinars to help families feel better equipped to know what to do when they needed to support their students. We also talked about whether there could be a parent Q&A sort of platform where there's a forum to help each other troubleshoot. Another idea, and Lisa's not here to talk about it in detail, but Lisa was super great about creating these checklists and worksheets that she uses sometimes with her clients. And we talked about how written guides and infographics could be another way to communicate information that was a simpler way to share with families some templates they could use. We were really big on one-pagers. And we talked about, even ongoing simple check-ins that could be done by paraprofessionals, counselors, et cetera. And finally, we know that there's been so many variations to what was okay in terms of school attendance and volume and formulas. So we thought every time that there was a change or a way to explain that, again, if we could find ways to simplify and streamline that would be most helpful to families. So that's just, 2 examples of how we managed 2 of those focus areas that we had as a panel. But it was a really good experience to weigh in, and I am not really as informed, I'm sure, about what has been adopted and what has been possible. But I do feel like Meg was really great at, taking into consideration the things that were being shared with us. And to the degree that things could be adopted quickly or not, certainly depended on staffing capacity and also just how guidelines were continually shifting. So I would certainly love to hear about that if anyone has any updates, but I will stop there and see if any other of the panel 1 members want to weigh in on anything else. No? Okay. All right, so are there any questions on anything that I shared today or any feedback?
Thank you so much for the presentation. That was great to get an overview of the 4 different areas and then to see some of the presentations on the consistency and the communication pieces. Are there any subcommittee members or school committee members with questions that they would like to ask the panel? Helen?
First of all, thank you for your work. Thank you all for your work. I mean, this is really an act of love to do this, and we appreciate it. I'm wondering what the feedback was from parents on the things that you recommended, from parents, teachers. So how did people receive this, do you think?
I felt like when we looked at the parent survey, it was pretty consistent. And, of course, at the time, all of us, including myself, had children in the public schools. And so there was variation there. But it did seem like, especially when we had some feedback from, say, special education advocates, we would see parts of that bubble up for accessibility and accommodations. And then you would see, the parents who talked about wanting a hub or just clarity of information. You had a different reaction from Runkle parents, for example, who did have a hub that they were referring to. So some of it was, I think, different depending on the school. But I feel like generally speaking, the inconsistency, was something we noted because some parents would say, oh, I heard this from our child's school. And the other one would say, we haven't heard anything yet. And so we know part of that is people just have different styles and workloads. And we were trying to see if there was a way to centralize more information with, of course, an outgoing interim superintendent. Of course, there's going to be difficulties with some of that. So certainly when Jim came on board, some of that became a little easier to think about how that could happen. But I feel like the group we had was very well representative of what I was seeing on the survey as well.
Thank you.
We also were able to implement a lot of, if not all of the work of the subcommittee. We posted quite a bit of information on, we had a hub for reopening, which I think was informed in large part by the subcommittee. We had parent updates that go out, I believe, every couple of weeks from Jim that update the community about where we are with certain reopening. I think that in terms of the wonderful presentations, and I know that Amanda was part of that, like so many of our committee members went out to principals and to sort of make the information in the buildings more consistent so that parents were getting this information in a more consistent basis. I could probably go on and on, but I think that panel one really had an impact on providing, I think, the district with the perspective of parents and also their wonderful expertise. So they were able to not only be the parents, but also to bring to bear their particular talents to actualize this for us. So,
yeah. Thank you. I'm glad to see that it was helpful. And, we certainly, as parents, we wanted it to work well, but I think just as a district, we wanted it to work well for everyone. And yeah, and I have to say hats off to you, because in the middle of that, you were able to move over to RLA, and that was a big move. So I think everyone was being super flexible, and it wasn't clear how much we should, sort of want to pivot to focusing on these recommendations. So I'm glad that eventually we were able to, be able to have the time to get those implemented.
And
I'm sorry. Did you
Sorry.
Go ahead?
Yeah, okay. I'm in panel one, but I'm also a parent in RLA. Both my kids attend RLA, so we are very happy to receive the principal's newsletter from Meg, which can contain a lot of useful information. And especially in the beginning of the semester, we got the 10 tips that is from our panel, Lisa, who made the graph to help us how to navigate in this special condition, how to help and support our kids. We really appreciate that. Also, I remember both the RA and other schools, they organize certain Zoom meetings, school-wide or class-wide, invite the teachers, parents to meet on Zoom. I think that's quite useful. Thank you so much.
One would hope also that a lot of the things that you recommended would continue on beyond the pandemic. The communication and family engagement is something that's important all the time, not just during a pandemic. And so some of these things that have worked well should hopefully continue.
Yeah, no, I agree that I think we're doing a lot of good learning about what, can happen if the box is sort of expanded as to where we can play and what kids can experience. And certainly, I think if we've established good relationships with families, or just we're able to see them in a more partnership model, that whatever we can keep from that is going to be a plus no matter what's going on. So, all right, awesome. I'm sure there are other panels that want to present. So, but thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really great. It's nice to hear some of the pieces that were implemented based on the recommendations, and things that, there's potential for keeping those things going, because they're just good practice. And so that's great. Thank you. Go ahead, Susan.
I just want to say one thing. So first of all, thank you to Kanan. You've put in so much time, given us so much of your expertise, and we're grateful that you're back. We wish you'd been on school committee here, but we understand that you are contributing elsewhere. But thank you for coming back. We're really lucky to have benefited from that. Two quick things. One is that Erin Cooley, who is now out on parental leave, was also somebody who I think benefited from the recommendations of panel one, especially in the earlier days of September and in August, September, October, trying to get reopening hubs up and running, and trying to consolidate information into really much more simple, much more graphic forms. I think sometimes in Brookline we tend to write really, really long emails, and so I think there were a number of times when the panel one sort of focus help people sort of consolidate and be much more have the simple message up front, and then maybe have more detail elsewhere if people were interested, but really kind of just to get those headlines out there. And that was so important. The other thing is that I think there were places where the principals, I think the principals and central staff both sort of said it would be amazing if we had resources to be able to kind of pull together some of these communication pieces. So even somebody who could, on a weekly basis, kind of consolidate from the principals what's best in all of those different newsletters, and then sort of ship it back out to them. So they could modify, they could make it their own, but there is some core of consistent information going out to everyone. And I do think, Meg, as you said, Jim's weekly emails are a great example of that. And similarly, I hope they go past the pandemic, but I think there were sort of things throughout here. And so I do wonder, and we'll ask this for all of the panels at the end, but it may be worth sort of thinking through where are there places where we think that progress has been made, but also where are there places where we would say, going forward, we think that these are really important priorities also, and either resource them or you find some way to make them happen. And I will just note that we are recording this, and so our new superintendent, who we just have voted in, will be able to take a look at it and sort of benefit, I think, from all of these documents and all of the expertise when he's trying to put together all the pieces. So there's more to come. These will keep living.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Susan. And it is really important to think about those things. And I'm so glad we need to highlight this video in all of the many recorded meetings so we can put it in front of our new superintendent with recommendations and thinking about that. I think the consistency and the communication are so important, and they're things that we really need to continue to keep at the forefront of how we move forward in all areas, and not just, it's not just the pandemic piece to it. So thank you so much. Are there any last words? I don't want to move on too quickly to the second panel. Did anyone want to add anything else? Thank you so much for making the time out of your lives to come and share with us again, in addition to all your work on the panels, to come and talk with us. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Our second panel is on the support to address the whole child experience. And our two co-chairs are Amanda Tarullo and Lindsay Fallon. And so we thank you. If you have any other members of your panel that you would like to introduce to us, that would be great as well, so we can connect them with panel 2. Thank you so much for coming again to share your ideas, your expertise, and your experience with us. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. And we are going to be tag teaming today. So let me just, can everybody see that okay? Wonderful. So I'm Amanda Tarullo, and Lindsay and I are going to be presenting together. I don't see anyone else from panel 2 at the moment. So today we're going to just, we want to just quickly review what was our original charge and some of the key themes that came out over the domains that we focused on last summer and early fall. And then we want to kind of update to where we are now and talk about, what are some of what we think are some of the key takeaways and suggested next steps over this spring, summer, and into next fall. So in terms of our charge, so our charge was to focus on wellness, out of school time, mental health, children's welfare, and to provide expertise and recommendations and guidance. And I'll show you who was on our committee in just a moment. So our liaison from PSB was Dr. Maria Lataz, and our school committee liaison was Mariah. Although Susan, I think, also came to all of our meetings, so they both, were amazingly supportive and engaged. This is the list of all of our members. We had really diverse expertise. So I'm a developmental psychologist. Lindsay is a school psychologist. We're both professors. We had a PE teacher, which was super helpful. And then we had folks that directed extended day programs, directed after school programs, had led extracurriculars out in the community, and had expertise in community engagement and empathy-based learning. So we really had expertise in a variety of different domains. So this is just a quick summary of what we did. We had 5 domains that we really focused on last summer, and those presentations are still indexed on the website in case anyone wants to look back and do a deeper dive. But we looked at physical wellness, at community building and extracurriculars, parent engagement, and then social emotional wellness broken up by developmental level, but for the K-5 and then separately for 6 to 12. These are some of the other things that we did. We gave Maria feedback on the restructuring the K-8 counseling website to make it more accessible for families. We talked about the universal screener and transitions first back to school and then the transition into the hybrid model. And at both points kind of talked about what supports could help kids make that transition. Matt Dubois was kind enough to share with us the district screening data from the panorama screening in the fall. And so we talked a lot about how to interpret that data and how that data could be used to have targeted identification and supports for students. We were able to meet with Dr. Marini and the RLA PTO, several of us, about advocating for the needs for more guidance support in RLA. And then recently we had a joint meeting with Panel 4 about child well-being and safe return to school. And these are some of the things that we have already done, that we did last summer and fall. This is the link to our presentations, and we have sort of, if you don't have an hour to watch each presentation, we have one-pager summarized recommendations for each that kind of sums up what we came to through our meetings and through the detailed presentations. We made some materials that were delivered to the district. I'm not honestly sure the extent to which, like Kanan, I'm not sure the extent to which they were actually implemented, but we did, Lindsay put together a template for parallel home and school expectations. So, you know, being able to link the home learning environment and school learning environment with parallel expectations. We also made who to contact lists that had customized information for each of the 9 elementary schools to help parents figure out who to reach out to when you're worried about something with your child in different domains. We contributed to Panel 1's amazing parent resource packet with some materials that were in our areas of expertise. We had weekly wellness tips. And then 3 of us were panelists in an event organized by Brookline Parents Organization in December, getting through the pandemic winter, sort of talking about how to maintain your kids' well-being. So I'm now going to hand things over to Lindsay, who's going to talk about our key recommendations in each domain.
Thank you. Yes, as Amanda mentioned, these presentations were an hour long, and I tried to distill the main points to one slide, so, or maybe 2 in some cases, but just wanted to share some of the key takeaways for our physical wellness presentation. And I'll just mention, like other panels, we had different presenters, sort of our group divided up and conquered different presentations based on their areas of expertise. So for our panelists who delivered the physical wellness presentation, they really emphasized the importance of movement and play and partnerships with area organizations like Brookline Rec and small businesses. So that was very important, and they sort of situated their thinking within an ecological model, like the one evidenced on the side screen there. Next slide. For the community building and extracurriculars presentation, all the presentations were fantastic. This was a really strong presentation about some of our amazing opportunities within Brookline to build partnerships within, oh, okay. I'm sorry, I was just reading the chat. I don't know if we can adjust the slide. I'm able to see it. So I'll keep going. But essentially the community building slideshow or presentation was really focused on social emotional wellness and thinking about ways to promote leadership and empathy and connection, both within school and outside of the school environment. And we thought of this sort of COVID year as being a great opportunity to link home and school in that way. So we emphasized the utility and value of service learning in that presentation. Next slide. We also had a really strong presentation around extended day programming and the value of that programming for the K-8 schools in particular. At BHS, I learned that there are over 100 clubs that the presenters really emphasize the importance of wellness and community that's sort of built within supporting those clubs. And so there was a presentation around just the sort of the intensity of the interruptions this year and how we might support when and if able to maintain consistency of those clubs meeting. We talked a lot about parent facilitation and family engagement and focusing specifically on parent stress. That was a theme that I think was started throughout our work as panel 2. And so we really promoted the ideas of just clear and consistent communication, having opportunities for ongoing family support, and really coordinating that as being not a one and done sort of training opportunity, but opportunities for sustained collaboration and support to families. And then we had a lot of discussions around leveraging social media to connect the community. For our social emotional wellness presentations, the first one was around, Amanda did a great presentation around just sort of biologically how brains develop and emotion regulation and what we can sort of expect by age. And so we wanted to emphasize in our presentation that trauma and stress associated with COVID-19 could impact impulse control, attention, emotion regulation, and that when supporting SEL in school or social emotional learning, we should really attend to that emotion regulation piece and make that part of the curriculum as often as possible. And I do think this has been a priority in my experience with the Brookline schools this year. So we were glad to see some of that play out in support for students. We also talked about the importance of a multi-tiered system of support framework to promote wellness in the schools, particularly for, well, I think across the grade levels, this is really important. And basically what this means is that there's an emphasis on what we provide to all students, our universal support practices, particularly this year and into next year when so many students might need that something more at school. Maybe it's counseling supports or just connections or lunch bunches or opportunities for socialization, maybe beyond what they would have needed in years past. And so instead of thinking about putting out fires, really investing in building up a strong foundation of universal or what we call tier 1 supports, because the need has been and will probably continue to be so great for so many, the resources may not align with what's, being able to really service every student individually. So by infusing or investing more in tier 1, we might be able to support more students efficiently in social emotional wellness. So we're thinking about this, or we were thinking about this as being embedded into our daily life at school, social emotional wellness being taught every day and communicated to families consistently. There was a great presentation by Amanda Grindstaff around mindfulness in the classroom, not only for students' benefit, but also for staff, because she was sort of responding to the pervasive sort of stress and burnout that she was seeing. And so I think that's an important point to make as part of our summary. And she used the term mental fitness as a way to think about social emotional wellness. So really practicing mental fitness and thinking about mindset and process and strategies and thinking of it as a tool that you strengthen or sort of a part of you that you strengthen every day. So I really appreciated her framing it in that way. We talked about opportunities to fund mental fitness offerings for staff and students. So specific ideas are listed on the slide, but also community resources that might be leveraged, and the importance of partnering with PTOs and other organizations in the community to do this work. So I was just going to read this. One of our panelists asked that we read this to you, so I said that I would. A critical issue to discuss with the curriculum subcommittee, which was raised indirectly during several of our panel 2 discussions, is the need for the schools, particularly the high school, to evaluate and slow down academic expectations and not treat this as if it's an ordinary year in regard to workload and grading. The schools, the high school in particular, cannot realistically hold students to the same academic standards as in other years. Kids are struggling to keep up. The work continues to accelerate, and many students are getting left behind. The escalation in poor grades is increasing stress, anxiety, and depression while decreasing self-esteem and students' sense of hope about their futures. There have been numerous articles discussing whether A to FE grades during this pandemic year are even useful or valid. If we're standing by a commitment to make mental, social, emotional health a #1 priority, we also need to redefine academic achievement this year because kids are falling apart. I speak from personal experience watching my 16-year-old, but I've heard many parents and students express concern about the same experience. It's heart-wrenching because some kids, understandably, including mine, fear that their grades from this year will significantly impact where they go after BHS and therefore the rest of their lives. Whether or not this is true is somewhat irrelevant because many students believe it to be true. While it's also unrealistic to expect that all students receive A's, there needs to be a different means for assessing students this year and a way to keep them all intact. Students' fear of failure is a legitimate barrier to their mental health. There needs to be far greater reflection and action on the nature of grading this year, and it needs to happen quickly as we move into the spring. So one of my final points before I toss it back to Amanda is really bridging on the work of other panels to center anti-racism and violence against minoritized individuals in our work. as it does intersect with social emotional wellness, mental fitness. So we are hoping that the district and the school committee will consider ways in which anti-racism and equity can be built into a task force if there isn't already such a body doing this work, to make immediate and long-term priority items related to building awareness and action in our community. So also to invest in anti-racism and anti-bias training for staff, and to encourage staff to self-reflect on their biases and the ways in which those biases might impact their decision-making and their actions within the school building, and just teaching, speaking up, and calling out racism.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. So we just want to make a few final points, sort of summing up what our takeaways are and what we think is important kind of going forward from where we are now. I think we brought up a vast number of things that we felt were important, and there was a lot of goodwill, but limited bandwidth, I think, to incorporate some of these concerns in this academic year, in part because the guidance staff, was not increased, even though the needs were greatly increased. And so, but, we're hopeful that there's a window of opportunity here, in the spring and in the fall, to try to address these needs that are pressing needs in our community, and hopefully to maybe use some of the available federal funds to try to access some of those to meet some of those needs. So we wanted to just, give you some thoughts on what our panel feels is important going forward. One key point is that no matter what learning model kids are in, whether they're currently, staying in remote learning, or whether they're in hybrid, or they're, in full-time in school, or have to go back to remote for a while, whatever happens, there's a need to identify kids who are experiencing elevated mental health symptoms, and to target individualized mental health support. One of the reasons that in-person school is often associated with better mental health is because of that individualized support. But as Lindsay mentioned, that depends on there being enough guidance staff to provide that support. And so that's a reason that more guidance counselors, psychologists, and social workers are needed to be able to meet those needs of efficiently identifying who needs extra support through the universal screener or through individual assessments, and then providing that individualized mental health support. Another concern that we wanted to raise is that, while at a group level in a whole population, mental health is likely to be better when kids are fully in school, that doesn't mean that being in person during a pandemic is going to be better for the mental health of every individual child. So individuals with higher health risk, maybe both a risk to their physical health and also, a real source of anxiety for them and their families, individuals who are high anxiety, and many children for attention reasons or internalizing reasons or externalizing reasons who have difficulty coping with frequent transitions and uncertainty. For all of those groups, being forced to return to in-person school before the pandemic is really over, before school is truly back to normal, is actually, we're concerned, could make mental health worse. And so we would like to, given that kids need predictability, and that it's sort of impossible, as you've seen how this year has gone, and it will be continuing to be the case if people need to quarantine, et cetera, to have real predictability, we would just argue that there is a need for some kind of continuing remote learning option for fall 2021. RLA has done an astonishingly, amazingly good job of that this year. But whether it's a scaled back version of RLA or some other virtual option, we just really want to speak up for the mental health of kids who, until the pandemic is over, are best supported by a virtual option. So here are our main takeaways and recommended next steps. First, for now, in the spring, and then continuing in the fall, a need to increase classroom-based social emotional learning curricula. To our knowledge, that's been fairly uneven in whether kids were getting that this year. And as Lindsay said, with a higher rate of mental health symptoms, in the Brookline school population, it's especially important to have that tier 1 intervention and prevention. Someone came to my daughter's class yesterday, and she was talking about it all day. She drew me, she's 7, she drew me a volcano rainbow and the different, the different tiers of what color you could be as you got closer and closer to blowing your top. And it was just, wonderfully done and so powerful for her. And so, those kinds of social emotional learning can really help kids learn to regulate their emotion, cope with stress, process negative emotions. Service learning is a really important opportunity. So that by that we mean community service opportunities for empathy-based learning through the classroom or through extracurriculars, and mental fitness offerings, things like mindfulness, yoga, whether that's through school or also, some of that could be provided through after school extracurricular programs to help build peer relationships, to help kids adjust back to interacting more in person and to process a sense of loss over this past year and adjusting to all of these transitions, which for every kid, even the best adjusted kids, takes processing. In the spring and fall, we would really urge repeating the universal screener and using that to target individual interventions based on that screening data. I think that is already planned for the spring, but I'm not sure where they are with that. But it's, the kids' mental health is definitely changing, and there may be kids that were fine last fall that are not fine now. So the importance of keeping track of where kids' well-being is. And then in the summer, if possible, hiring additional guidance staff and social workers to help kids get back to a better state of mental health in the fall. And then we would also advocate for training teachers and helping them to identify mental health problems and helping them to play a role in that classroom-based support of social emotional wellness, because there will be a higher need for, there's a higher need for it now, and there will continue to be a higher need for it next year beyond what a guidance staff can really fully do. Finally, and this is really, panel one has been really expert in their suggestions for planning and improved communication structure with parents. And so we would argue that everything they're suggesting would be really valuable for supporting child well-being as well. Some of that universal communication, such as, if a kid learns a technique in classroom-based social emotional learning, it would be great to tell parents about that technique so that they could implement it at home and you have some continuity in the home and school settings. And then also, of course, for kids who are experiencing mental health problems, more individualized communication as well. So thank you so much for the opportunity for us to share our thoughts and what we've been working on, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for questions. Is there any members who would like to ask any questions of panel 2 in their presentation? Okay, so, okay. Go ahead, Helen, and then I'll go.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you. Thank you guys for all the work that you've done and the the efforts that you've put into it. I think it's really important. Just to full disclosure, I'm a social worker by training, so I get a lot of the things you're saying. I guess I'm a little concerned about your recommendation for an RLA in the fall, and wonder whether putting more emphasis on helping to reintegrate those children who have anxiety, who have, may even be school phobia at this point or school refusal. As you said, being in school is the best place for kids. Or I think you said that. Maybe I didn't. Maybe it was the first group that said that. I feel that being in a social environment with kids their own age, learning to interact, all those things are important, and in addition to the education that one gets in school. So I'm not sure if there's a real question there, but there's more of a feeling that, I do think we need to do things this summer, not in the fall, but this summer to start helping kids to reintegrate with other children as it becomes, it is safe now. We've seen that from, panel 4 and the things they've been saying about kids being in school. Just to help the parents and the kids, because it's not just the kids, it's the parents too who we need to help to feel comfortable coming back into where they were before.
So I guess just to respond to that, I think if the pandemic were totally over, I would completely agree with you. Like certainly we're not
we always have we have the flu, we have all sorts of things, you know, that I'm not making the pandemic and the flu the same. I'm not trying to say that.
It's you know, there are epidemiological predictions that things may spike again next winter, not like this winter, but there could be disruptions. There could be, you know, there already are, you know, things going on like classes, like we got an email from Lawrence for the kids that are in hybrid that there's a class that had to quarantine. So part of what I'm speaking to is the need for certain kids who need predictability, who need, you know, where the uncertainty and the chaos of, you know, what through nobody's fault at all. This year's been a lot of like switching around, who's going what day? Are we going to school? Are we not going to school? Right? You know, whereas RLA has been very predictable and stable. And I guess I would also just push back a bit on the idea that RLA is not real school, because
I didn't say that.
No, but I mean, you say they need to be in school. Like, I think they are in school, right?
Children. They need to be with other children, I think. They need that social interaction. They need that to be able to develop and grow.
I think some of the remote teachers have done an amazing job of creating that, even remotely. I guess I would just encourage the panel, the school committee, to think about the fact that what's best for the group as a whole may not be the best for all the individual children. And I wonder if it might be worth talking to RLA parents, because I will say that I have heard a lot of concern from you know, plenty of RLA parents are ready to go back, but there is a subset that are very concerned and haven't been vocal this year because they did have a virtual option, but are kind of shocked at the idea that there wouldn't be. And, you know, there are kids with more serious asthma or reasons where it would still be a risky environment for them as well. So it's not, you know, it's just something to consider.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Susie?
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, thank you, Amanda and Lindsay. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry about that. I'll put my hand down as well. I'll be brief. So I know that you addressed loss, and I was just wondering if you were also thinking about grief, first of all, and then knowing that school will not go back to normal in the fall. We know that there's going to probably be more screen time than there has been before the pandemic. That's, you know, digital learning is going to be kind of embedded to some extent. What can we do about the impact of so much screen time on kids' behavior and psychology? And then finally, and this is kind of contradictory to what I'm just asking, thinking about how we might have to scale up to deal with a lot of psychological impacts for a lot of children, beyond hiring more psychologists or counselors, and also thinking about meeting kids where they are. Can we do something creative with, you know, conversational investigation with kids via chats or TikTok and stuff like that?
Do you want to take the first part, Amanda, and then I can take the second part of the question?
Sure, around screen time, or sorry, what
yeah,
was the
the
first
screen
part?
time. So
the screen time.
Yeah.
Brief screen time, and then I'll take the last.
Sorry, multi-parter.
Sure. No, great. It was all great questions. So around grief, absolutely. I mean, I think if, you know, for some kids, there's more severe grief. There's actual loss of a grandparent, you know, loss of a person, but for everyone, there's a loss of this year, right? Yep. And there's a loss of the team that they should have been on, and there's a loss of their, you know, transition to the first year of high school, and, you know, all of that. And so, you know, that's where I think a lot of classroom-based processing is really helpful to acknowledge that. And as you said, school won't be entirely normal. And so also kind of very overtly naming that and helping kids process, like, in what ways will it be like the spring? In what ways will it be different from the spring? In what ways will it still be different from the past, right? And just really helping, particularly for the younger kids, to make that very concrete, and for the older kids to give them a chance to process and to share their own thoughts about that. For the screen time, Lindsay knows more about this than I do, but I'll just briefly say there is a good bit of research showing that contingent responses on screen time are really different than passive screen time. So that, you know, interacting over the screen is a very different thing than kind of being zoned out over the screen, or even playing video games over the screen. So I think, you know, it is a concern, but I think as long as that's the kind of screen time that it is, I think it's not as bad.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, and just to your last question, I think there's a real opportunity in Brookline. And again, this might be happening and I am not aware of it, but from my experience working with other districts, it's underutilized. Is when I presented that pyramid with the universal tier 1 and then the tier 3, where we think of our most intensive needs with individualized supports for kids, there's a tier 2 that many districts underutilize, where you can provide that something more, that more intensive support that's not individualized, and it's more like oftentimes group based. So you can kind of scale up support without completely maxing out your resources with regard to personnel. And I think that's where to focus this coming year would be on strengthening tier 1 and introducing more tier 2 supports that could be delivered in a small group format to provide more supports to students, kind of numbers wise, that are still impactful and then can make a difference to them, and have progress monitoring tools that will support making decisions around if students are responding to those supports, and if they keep needing them, or if they need more intensive supports, or maybe they are okay going back to just having those universal supports again. So it's a fluid process where data are used to make decisions around the intensity of support provided.
Thank you.
Sorry, Suzanne, I was calling on you before and
No, that's fine.
miscommunication.
No,
Go ahead.
no, that's fine. Thank you, Jennifer. This is actually more of a comment. I want to thank you, of course, for all your hard work and all your expertise. I appreciate that you did not spend time talking about learning loss. I know we're talking about loss of the year, loss of activities we're used to, loss of fun and being with our friends. But I think it's important that we let people know, our teachers and our students, that wherever they come to us, however they come back to us, that's just fine. They've learned a lot this year. It may not be quite as testable as we've done in the past. It's not like math facts. It's about all the things they've learned this year, and that we will take our children wherever they come back to us, and we will move them forward. And I think that that's a loss they should not worry about, that we don't have to worry about that. We're going to find out what our children know and what they need to go forward with their learning. So I actually appreciate that you did not say that. So that's kind of a funny way to say it, but thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Is it okay if I do my comments now, Susan, and then I'll go to you to wrap up? Because I do want to be mindful. We only have a couple minutes left for the panel 2 time if we're going to try to stay on time and be respectful. I wanted to
and Jennifer, just excuse me, but Scott Moore has his hand up. So I just.
Oh, okay, great. And then we'll go to Scott. Is that okay, Scott, or did you have an urgent interjection? No, you're good. Okay, good. Thank you. I just wanted to talk about the idea about investing in the tier 1 supports. I do see a lot of inconsistency, and I think I really like the way you worded about it, that it's better to invest in a few practices and do them well than to have many partially implemented strategies. So that's something that I really think an investment in that tier 1 and that consistent practice and is really beneficial. And also that daily practice and not just an occasional practice is really important. And then that final sort of, for me, that bridge of bridging it to home so that the language and strategies used in school can be carried over. And that really builds that homeschool partnership. So I think that's really beneficial. Sorry, I just wanted to sort of highlight that piece because I think it's really integral. Once you have that really strong tier 1 supports, then you can start to look at those tier 2 supports, but we also need more additional, I think, staff in social work and school psychologists to support the large body of students that'll be returning in the fall. Susan and then Scott, and then we'll, if there are no further questions, move to panel 3, I think.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you to panel 2 as well. I think that the notions of physical fitness, mental fitness have been so front and center, but I think that what you have given us is sort of a very specific set of recommendations and sort of how to think about it. And I really appreciate that, and hope we can kind of continue that conversation when we get through the budget piece. Just to Suzanne's point on learning loss, panel 1 did talk about learning loss, and Can, I don't know if you want to mention, I know there was a conversation about literacy, but panel 2 was really focused on sort of whole child wellness, kind of social emotional pieces, but there was just, and Jen, feel free to say no, but there was a sort of a quick piece on learning loss, or literacy assessments, I should say. It wasn't learning loss.
Yeah, thank you for that. My colleague on the panel, Miriam, wanted me to make this point. And so I have her email that I'm going to just use her words verbatim because she is the expert on this. But she says, as students, particularly in the early grades, return to school in person, it's important to get an accurate picture of their reading skills and determine who needs additional support. Some students will be progressing very well in spite of the disruptions, but others will not be where they need to be. The assessment that is currently used, and then she mentioned Fontes and Pinnell benchmark assessment, is time-consuming and lacks adequate validity and reliability. I know that for some time now, district leaders have been discussing which DESE-approved literacy screening monitoring tool they will adopt in order to be in compliance with the Massachusetts dyslexia screening law. I would urge them to make that choice as soon as possible if they have not done so already, and implement it this spring in order to inform planning for the rest of this year and summer. And so I wanted to just make that point because as we're talking about a reentry plan, certainly thinking about learning loss assessments and, to Amanda's point, even if we're trying to assess where kids are in terms of their social emotional well-being, there's a lot of linkages to how they're doing academically. And so I wanted to make sure I mentioned Miriam's point there before we closed out on looking at some of these issues regarding how students are doing when they come back to school. So thanks for letting me add that, Susan.
I think, Susan, did you have any other questions or can we move on to Scott? Go ahead.
No, I did, but in the interest of time, please, we'll keep going, please.
My question was quick for Amanda and Lindsay. The recommendation around a remote academy in the fall or an RLA in the fall, is that mostly motivated by a health and safety concern? Or are you hearing within your group that for some students, the learning for them in that kind of environment actually was beneficial in any kind of way, right? Yeah, it clearly, just like anything, there's no one size fits all for anybody. I'm curious to know if there was anything that you were hearing positive about it in such a ways that you think that might be an option that we should be considering in Brookline.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. We are hearing that for several groups of students. One group is students with attention difficulties, that for some of those students being away from the distractions of the classroom and actually made it, a number of parents have said that has actually helped their kid to focus in and make more progress academically than they had been making in person. And there's variation across students, but there are students for whom that was true, where just the classroom was overstimulating and they were able to kind of focus. Kids who had anxiety around particular subjects, there are a number of kids that have made progress in subjects where social comparison was making them really very stressed, and being away from that let them kind of calm down and get those foundations more individually. And then kids with social anxieties and other anxieties. And thank you, Meg, a really good point. There's been 0 incidents of bullying. And I have actually heard from individual parents whose kids were being bullied in person, that this year has just been a godsend in terms of that kind of reset. So those are a number of the groups where there really has been a benefit. Parents may vary on whether that's kind of a temporary, whether they want to do that for a limited time or what, but I do think we're not panel 4, so we're not speaking from a safety perspective, we're speaking from an emotional wellness perspective.
Thank you.
Jennifer, may I add one more comment in response to what Ken-Ann said? Okay, just to echo Ken-Ann's point, I've also became sort of aware of the use of Fontes and Pinnell, and I know there's been some research around science of reading that indicates that it might not be the best option. And it reminded me of the fact that we had recommended a universal screening procedure, and that we were thrilled that was implemented. That might not have had anything to do with our recommendation, but we were happy to see it occur. The screener that was chosen, although it is a kind of functional for many reasons, based on my review and review of several of my colleagues, doesn't have really strong technical properties. And I just wanted to make that point that I think it's hard to sometimes select the best tool when things are packaged nicely. And I would just say, as part of our recommendations, just encouraging selection of strong tools that will really meet the needs, particularly around universal screening.
Does the panel have recommendations on that specifically? When you say
the panel does, tool? But I can.
Okay.
Yes, the panel. I would be happy to provide recommendations off.
I'm just curious.
Yeah,
sure.
Okay. Miriam did too on her particular recommendation, so I can certainly. I think that's also in the summary emails, but I can certainly forward that again.
Yeah, I would be interested if if incoming in the all the free time that you all have, as we all do, if you come across that material, it would be great to share those specifically as well. I mean, and one of the things I wanted to say before we move on is also that the panel's presentations are all on the Public Schools of Brookline website. And you can go, they're listed under the Ad Hoc Task Force and Remote Learning and Expert Advisory Panels on our website. So if you go to the school committee page under Ad Hoc Task Force on Remote Learning and the Expert Advisory Panels, you will get the full historical list of all of the presentations and materials. So members of the public and school committee members and anyone else who is interested in that information, all of that is there as a resource as well. And I believe it's listed chronologically. Thank you to our panel 2 members, both for sharing that information and all of your hard work and time and dedication. Thank you so much. It's so appreciated. Thank you for coming today. We are pretty close to on time. I'd like to move us on, if we can, to panel 3. So a thank you to panel 3 for coming. Today we have Janet Rankin and Ann Spencer coming to talk with us on remote learning capacity building. So welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks very much. This is Janet. I'm going to share my screen, and a number of the panelists are going to jump in and present a few of the slides. So let me just get going here. So we are Expert Advisory Panel 3, which was in the initial title is Remote Learning Capacity Building. You'll see I made a little switch to that. It's an old trick. If you don't like the assignment, just do something else, right? Everybody hear me okay? Yes, okay. We had a great panel, incredible heavy hitters on this panel. And I have to say that I feel a little bit like Typhoid Mary or somebody, because I've had 3 co-chairs since it started, but I'll try not to take it personally. And Kaufman Frederick was my first co-chair, well, anyway, we had a lot of other co-chairs. Ann was the second one. And, but Ann Spencer is the current co-chair, and I really appreciate her stepping in and just like dragging the panel out of the ashes, I think, at some level. So that was great. The list of folks are here, and the people that are on the call and will be presenting are Ann Spencer, Stephen Ehrenberg, Sally Madsen, and Dave Myers. And then we were also really lucky to have district collaborators, Michelle Herman, who's the Director of Professional Development, and Scott Moore, the Director of Ed Tech and Libraries. So they played an integral role in the panel's work and helping us navigate certain things in the district. Just an overview. So what we should change the charge a little bit, or the title a little bit, to be Enhanced Brookline Educators Teaching Capacity for Remote and Hybrid Learning. And so that's just a subtle change, but I think it was important. We produced 5 recommendations to support Brookline educators in their work of teaching our students during the pandemic and beyond. And I think this is a theme that's come up for all the panels, is that nobody wants to relive the past year. Nobody thinks it was fun or anything, but I think we all learned an incredible amount amount of things that really to support our students to teach better, just a whole variety of things. And I think we owe ourselves the opportunity and the time to think about how we can carry some of those things forward past this particular pandemic into perhaps completely smooth waters, or into waters that are not smooth for other reasons. What we did is we considered the structures, the processes, and the practices that are working well currently in Brookline, and those that can and should be improved. And our recommendations are based on published research and best practices. And as I said, we had fabulous input from senior members of the administration. And then I also should add that that Susan Wolf-Ditkoff was our liaison from the committee. For each recommendation, we're going to outline the how, past and ongoing efforts, so that we're going to embed the things that we did throughout the year in those recommendations. And then we also broke out the investments needed in terms of time, FTEs, and money for each of the recommendations. And I think one of our big kind of takeaways, or our big kind of things we want folks to know, is that, you know, we're all in this together. We all have a common goal, and we all have a role to play: teachers, administrators, school committee, and parents. There's a sort of a more fleshed out report, which is available as well. This is just sort of the high level. So we had a series of recommendations to the Brookline Public Schools, and I think Dave Myers is going to jump in and do those. So.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. And thank you everyone for the opportunity to share these recommendations and hear your questions and thoughts. So this first recommendation, well, you can read it there. I'll give you a second to read it. And then there's some detail around it. Janet, if you want to make the detail pop up. Oh, you're on mute, Janet. Oh, there we go. Okay. Great. So you can see that we've got the why, the how, and examples of this that are, in some cases, they were happening before a little over a year ago. In some cases, they popped up in the past year. And in the bottom right corner, the type of investment that's needed. So in terms of this mix of synchronous and asynchronous learning activities, obviously, starting with the why, in the past year, for worse, oftentimes, and occasionally for better, teachers were forced into learning modes that were new, and I think for worse, they were cut off from a variety of learning modes, from those in-person learning modes. Whole tools in their teacher tool belt were removed from them, and they were forced into a limited set. Well, the hope is that after all this is over, there's a whole new way of figuring out of meeting the needs of individuals, small groups, specific content areas, and really looking forward to figuring out what is the potential for some of these new tools that folks have discovered. And that's really, when I say folks, I mean teachers and students in this learning relationship. The second bullet there on the why is really about I think the key words there are time to reflect, assess, and practice together, and giving teachers the space to experiment and make mistakes, learn from each other, really learn, do the things they have been doing, but all of which has been really forced to be into really a overly compact feedback loop during the pandemic. They've been forced to learn an enormous amount of teaching approaches in a very short period of time, with a lot of external pressures, not a lot of room to make mistakes and learn from them. All right, so in terms of the how, I think you can start with the big bold text there, starting with the learning goals. What are the goals, and then what are the pedagogical modes that match those learning goals? Let's expect challenges and let's deal with them together. Easy access to support for teachers, and then really getting involved in the dialogue, allowing teachers to get in and encouraging them to get involved in dialogue outside of Brookline. And on the right-hand side, there are a few examples there of this happening. And then let me just explain the bubbles there with the investment. So when it's filled in, that's you can think of that as a check. So time to implement this, it's significant. FTEs, there are some detailed recommendations that, maybe looking at the ways that other districts in the state, other districts around the country have thought about organizing digital pedagogy, So maybe there's an FTE recommendation there that would cost some money. And then the money comes in providing the supports for the teachers. So let's move on to recommendation 2. Defining the educator competencies for digital learning and self-assessment tools. This is for educator growth, not student growth, but these self-assessment tools for educator growth. So the why, we've got to clearly define, what do I need to be good at? So as an example, if I'm an elementary school teacher, I've got to know how to run a morning meeting. If I'm an ELA teacher, I've got to know how to lead a text-based discussion. How does that, those types of goals need to be identified in the digital world and narrowed down so that it doesn't feel to teachers they've got to learn everything all at once. So what are those core competencies? Why have we chosen those above others? On the how part, there's a lot of great work that's been done in the district, amazing work that's been done in the district, as well as in state and national organizations. There's no reason to build a whole set of competencies from within. Lots of people have spent a lot of time, done a lot of research. Those should be borrowed, stolen, and applied here. The last 2 under how, encourage experimentation and creativity. Use the spirit that is here among Brookline teachers. Yes, certain things need to be standardized, and we did that with the LMS and ways to communicate with parents, but really encourage creativity and the experimentation that is exciting for students and teachers. And then I spoke about the time and the space. I'll skip the initiatives and move on to my colleagues.
Great. So our third recommendation is around providing technology tools, support resources, and a professional learning community around the use of these tools. Why? The remote and hybrid learning approaches and many of the specific tools are new for some of our district's educators. So having tools and support will help them build a baseline foundation to apply these new approaches. And then professional learning communities, as we know, enable teachers to ask questions, learn from each other, share best practices, that type of thing. One of the big hows here, there are a lot of grassroots organic knowledge sharing things that happen, for example, among a group of middle school science teachers. What we're recommending here is scaling through centralized resources just to make sure that nobody is without access among educators. And these initiatives are well into motion with a lot of progress over the course of this year. The district maintains a staff support site and other knowledge sharing platforms. Our panel's been fortunate to be able to collaborate on this with Scott Moore, who's here today. Teachers have gotten an increase in collaboration time. There's professional development, curriculum support. So our recommendation is to continue investing in and scaling these initiatives. As you can see down there at the bottom, this is time consuming. Knowledge sharing is time consuming, and it's an intentional behavior that people have to sign up for, whether they're incentivized to do that by some structures or whether they're doing it out of their own curiosity. It takes time and it takes effort. It's not a whole lot of additional resources in terms of people and money. It's more really about like spending the time to learn from one another. And so having some dedicated time for collaboration is really important. Go to the next slide.
And yeah, I was just going to add that there have been some efforts. There are efforts in the district already that are ongoing in terms of learning communities and other projects through Central.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oops.
The fourth recommendation is to monitor and evaluate the impact of new learning practices and tools on student learning in order to inform approaches going forward. So as our colleagues on panel 2 alluded to, there have been changes in academic expectations this year, which are appropriate. However, it's still important to monitor learning outcomes as new tools and methods are introduced to inform the district and the educators on where more support is needed, which methods should stick beyond the short-term fixes into the long term, because in fact, many of the things that we're seeing in terms of using digital tools for both synchronous and asynchronous learning have real potential beyond the pandemic situation. So the hows here, defining metrics of success. And again, this is a place where we can benchmark against what others are doing in other school districts. And then using a set of common tasks to collect information about what's working and what's not working to inform instructional adjustments. So for those of you, familiar with the term of formative assessment, measuring things in order to see what do we need to adjust going forward, not just a test at the end of the year that's kind of the sum of everything that's happened beforehand, but little things that inform the direction going forward. This is relatively low investment in terms of people and money. It does take time to really define what those metrics are and make sure that you're doing those small assessments along the way.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so I'm going to really be very brief in talking about number 5 here. Obviously, our experience and the other panel's experience suggests that there is an opportunity to continue the momentum that these panels have had throughout the past year. So we're recommending that we develop, the school committee and the district develop ways to better leverage the expertise within Brookline's community, as well as the support within the Brookline community in order to more rapidly scale and, of course, cost effectively help the Brookline public school system achieve its goals. So, obviously we already have some models, scaling expertise. It was expert panel 4, whose work is still underway. And I think we'd all agree that their contributions have been significant and irreplaceable. Our own panel members created a variety of different training devices and tools to help support teachers as they were coming on board this fall and preparing for the new curriculum. And then also Matt Gillis recruited a number of community volunteers to do a variety of different tasks related to ventilation, etc. So I think that you will find that there is a lot of expertise, but also a lot of interest in community members to really help support our public schools and help support our teachers and our instructors, as well as central administration. So I would like to think that in some way, shape, or form, the good work that our panels are doing continues. And if you look at the investment needed, it's really mostly about time. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anne. I'll be very brief with the first steps that we're suggesting, but first I just want to take a step back. I think it would be helpful, Jennifer, to take these recommendations that we've made in 3 ways. One is that they were initially designed as capacity development recommendations for helping teachers use technology during the pandemic. And I think Anne's slide, especially about leveraging expertise, is the way that this panel delivered the most value there. But the other 2 are, these recommendations are both for improving education access and quality generally, but also in helping the district build a more resilient district. So as Amanda was saying in the last presentation, when we're faced with the next disruption, which is surely coming, and it could be a COVID variant, or it could be several years on, we're well prepared and we're not caught as flat-footed. So we see this as both, investing, getting some bang for the buck in terms of district resources, resulting in immediate dividends, but also setting up the district so that further disruptions don't knock us offline and cause so many different kinds of loss for students and teachers. Okay, so with that said, our recommended first steps are: 1, to learn from the past year. There's no reason to throw out this past year. We've learned a lot about the use of hybrid and remote technologies, and we should document that. So we suggest conducting a rapid qualitative assessment, especially of educators, to determine what practices were seen to have worked best. That's the first. The second is perhaps done with this meeting, is to identify a subcommittee that will lead the review of these recommendations and determine whether or not they're adopted in collaboration with Dr. Guillory going forward. So that could be curriculum, or that also could be the policy review subcommittee. The third, I think, is the most important for right now. As we all know, we have an opportunity right now when the district receives federal funds under the American Rescue Act to program some of it for education. Obviously, we're not just going to receive 60% of the funds like we receive town funds to implement educational programs and services. We have to justify that. We have to provide a rationale for that. So we suggest that this panel be recharged with a new mandate, and that is, one, to develop an implementation plan on behalf of the district, working with central administration, and two, to support the central administration immediately to develop proposals, perhaps concept notes backed by back of the envelope budgets, to present to the town, so that we could begin to program some of the money that's supposed to expire by 2024 for the specific purpose of developing resilience in this town, which is part of why these funds are being programmed for us in the first place. So if I were to urge on one of these three first steps first, it would actually be the third one, because this seems to be an urgent task. I know there's a lot of confusion about, there's not a lot of detail around how that money is supposed to be earmarked, but this could be a way to use expertise on this panel right away, both technical expertise as well as policy development expertise. The fourth one is that we simply have a process going forward, providing updates to the school committee and the general community on progress towards implementation of these recommendations. And then the fifth one is that we act urgently on this for the reasons that Amanda spoke so eloquently of before, which is that there is potential for further disruption. Thanks.
That's it. You can stop sharing. Everybody knows what the slide says.
Are there any questions from subcommittee or committee members? Thank you so much for coming and sharing your ideas and your expertise with us, and all of the hard work that you've been doing for many, many months. I guess I have two things that I wanted to respond to. I think there's many things, but just in response to some of the things that have popped up towards the end, in particular, one is that I love the sort of like visual icon of sort of FTEs and time and money. So when I see time, I start putting that into terms of FTEs, because we are short-staffed, and the staff that we have are maxed out. So there is no more. It's not just, for me, it's not just simply a matter of time, because we don't have people who have more time that they can take. So all of those lots of bubbles equal money, because they equal FTEs. So they're sort of everything once you start hitting that. So that's one of my concerns with this idea of building capacity. And I was actually wondering, Susan, if you could maybe speak briefly about the ARA funds and sort of where that's at with finance, and the budget right now is, sort of resting also with the superintendent and finance. And maybe you could just speak to that for a second for folks.
Sure. So I think there are a lot of recommendations in here that that are also envisioned in ARPA, but I think there are also ones that are just leveraging our budget differently. So for example, we are slated to get, by the estimate of the Mass Municipal Association, something on the order of $34 million to be spent in the next 2.5 years. It'll come in 2 tranches, one soon, well, depending what soon is, but imminently, and then another one next year. There are sort of a set of, it's both very restrictive, but it's also very open. It has to be used for COVID-related relief. And then there are a whole lot of very specific things after that. So I think part of it is how to make a clear case that something is, relief related, some of which is easier than others. I mean, my sense is that a lot of the conversations we're having about whether we use this language of learning loss or not, I think that's probably one of the areas, and sort of making sure that kids are it's going to be a couple of year process to restore or get to a new place. Not everything will be restored. And so between that 34 million, there's sort of another allocation which we may be eligible for. Norfolk County has an allocation. And so if Norfolk County were to do it based on population, which they almost certainly will not, but if they were, that would be an additional $11 million. And then there are other pots of money as well, sort of the ESSER money, sort of the final answer on where that lands. So I do think that there are a number of moving parts. I just want to say that there are also some earmarked funds, so funds for summer school, funds for mental health. There are sort of a number of things that have their own line item, which doesn't mean that's all we can spend, but I think figuring out how, since money is fungible, figuring out how to arrange those pieces is actually a really important piece of it. So I don't know how much of that's going to happen before the end of this year, but I think it's probably, if I were to guess, it's going to be a pretty important project this summer to sort of figure out what that's going to look like over the next 2 years to spend it well.
Yeah, I would also just say, money is fungible. I think effort is fungible as well. And I certainly appreciate, because I think of all the panels, we were, the most exposed to some of the central administration issues that you've just mentioned, Jennifer, because I know Michelle and Scott were, constantly pressed against the wall with all of the work, the avalanche of work that they and their teams had to do. And so, you have this classic conundrum of, I'm so busy, I can't do everything, but I don't have time to spend an hour helping someone else come up to speed so that they can help me. So I'm trying to, with slide number 5, I think in particular, and I think Steve is talking about this as well. Can we create that support framework in the back so that at least the next time there's something like this, because there's gonna be, and there still is, we have some sort of framework for helping you folks. And it doesn't even matter how it is. I heard, I think it was the first or second panel talking about having a common template for communications. I mean, that's something that a graphic artist like myself, I could build that template. I can be the support system. So it takes away some of that administration so they can actually focus their efforts on something that is student facing or teacher facing that's much more important. So I think there are some ways if we get a little creative.
Can I just add very quickly, just to be clear, we're not proposing to drive the process of producing proposals to the district to spend whatever portion of the ARA funds that goes to education. We're simply offering the panel as a resource to Dr. Guillory and the school committee should they need it. We recognize how stretched capacity is right now. This is a response to that.
Right.
Thank you. Suzanne, I saw your hand and I just want to be mindful of the time. We do have a few.
Yeah, I'll just make this good. I feel like we're getting mixed messages from the expert panels, which says continue work with asynchronous learning. It's important. We've learned a lot. And then Desi and Riley and Baker are saying asynchronous hours are not going to count towards time on learning. And anyway, I feel it's like a mixed message to me. So I think it's something we may have to, as a committee, delve into a little deeper and see exactly what that's about.
Well, if I can just say really quickly, and I'm going to actually borrow from Scott Moore because he and I had a lot of conversations about this. I think maybe there is some confusion, and forgive me if we created that. Asynchronous, remote, it doesn't matter. The use of digital technology is going to be part of our students' future, of our teachers' future. And I think there was an opportunity to be in denial, not needing to use Canvas completely or Google, Classroom or Seesaw Classroom completely. And then all of a sudden everyone had to. So I think there needs to be a recognition that there needs to be a blended approach to the use of technology in service to pedagogy and creating a framework that supports that.
Right, and I totally agree, Ann. And then just jumping in, I mean, asynchronous you know, if your student does homework, that's asynchronous learning. So clearly asynchronous learning, I mean, I understand that's a statement that comes out, it's not going to count, but clearly asynchronous learning counts. So how do we leverage what we know about the digital aspects of digital asynchronous learning to actually support student learning? That's all. I mean, it's all in the pot together, but the words, I think, are not, there's not a clear definition about what somebody means when they say asynchronous learning. I think it's really the state anyway.
Well, I do think it'll be really interesting to sort of get that feedback. I think one of the things that was mentioned, and I don't know what slide it was on, it was early, I think, about getting educator feedback and family feedback on what has worked well and, you know, what pieces they might want to keep, what was difficult, what may, you know, I don't know, just sort of soliciting that feedback, I think, is an important part of the process. So we know what worked well and what we want to continue. Are there any other folks that have questions that they'd like to ask of panel 3 while we have a number of our members with us here? I am so grateful that you were all able to come. You've done an incredible amount of work. We are so appreciative of that. I can't tell you enough how much we appreciate all of your time and your expertise. I'm so glad that you could come today and join us. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I do want to bring up one more thing before we go, which is just an FYI on our upcoming curriculum subcommittee meeting. So we will be meeting on Monday, April 12th, which is an additional meeting that we had not previously scheduled on our yearly calendar from 4 to 5. We'll be coming back to the summer school question now that we have a little bit of information on some more of the finances. And we'll also be discussing the extended school year programs, as well as possible discussion of compensatory services. And then on Tuesday, April 27th, we'll be meeting from 4 to 5:30, and we'll be coming back to this great conversation, which was mentioned in panel 3. Their presentation is the essential curriculum. As a tangentially to that, we won't be discussing it at the next meeting, but part of that is sort of that portrait of a graduate. But we'll be coming back to the essential curriculum conversation on the 27th to get some more information about that process, as well as our child study team, which I think is also an important part of this process as we set up for the fall and assessing student needs and getting information as well, and consistency and communication. So then those are our main agenda items. Are there any last questions before we go? Susan?
Yeah, so I will resist the urge to thank everyone again, but in the interest of time, pretend I did all that effusively. I will thank Scott and Michelle and Meg, who spent so much time in thoughtfulness, helping shape these recommendations and really helping to implement them and lead that implementation. So thank you to each of the 3 of you specifically. You know, I think the first step here was just to get the recommendations out so that people knew what was here. I think the clear next step is, now that we've there's so much here to absorb, hearing the research, hearing, you know, the presentations, but really a lot of the conversations we're having this summer, this spring in budget season really do speak to kind of the equity issues and mental, you know, fitness, physical fitness. So I guess one thing that we might want to think about is offline, Jen, so not in meeting, try to process some of this. And as we think about priorities going forward, find ways to not only report back out on the good things that have happened, which is important to do, and celebrate those, and also to sort of figure out where are there places where we think, you know, as we build this budget and build priorities for next year, where those places need to be as well. So it seems to me that would probably be next, and being able to sort of synthesize these and sort of bring them forward into the budget process.
Yeah, and just to that point, I'm assuming that the districts, that members of the staff here from the district side are also integrating or looking at and evaluating which of these recommendations, you know, can be implemented, you know, based on FTEs and time and money, and when we consider the budget. And so I'm making an assumption that staff on the staff side are reviewing these and taking a look at that. I think it's really important for the school committee to understand the work of the panels. And, you know, I was able to go to some of the meetings last summer, but then when just speaking for myself, when school starts back up, you know, I'm not available at the right times for most of the panels. So it's very helpful for me to have the presentations and the information posted so that I can look at that stuff and review that. And so I think that it's important for the school committee to sort of get a picture as well, if they've not been able to attend the individual meetings, to understand the scope and depth and breadth of the panel's work and their recommendations, and to see, you know, in what ways can we take this and leverage all of this to make the school district better and stronger. So I think everybody who's on the panels and all of the staff who worked in conjunction with the panels and the school committee members who are running the ad hoc task force on remote learning during this really stressful and busy time. So I thank everyone for doing that. Everyone's under incredible amount of stress and work. And so I encourage everyone after this meeting to practice some self-care and to practice some wellness as well for themselves. Are there any other last statements or questions? I just want to be really respectful of people's time. I'm known to talk a lot, so I'm trying to talk less. Yes, Scott?
I just wanted to say thanks to our own group, as well as it's really been a pleasure this afternoon to hear from all the other groups and kind of hear them all collectively together. Like, I'm writing down these notes being like, oh, there's these connections. And I think as the groups are working separately, it's something like this pulls it together. And it's been nice to sit here and my mind's going. So I think that's what it's supposed to do. So I'm glad I was here. I was here for my group, but I was really glad I was here to hear everything. So thanks to the other groups. Very informative as well. And of course, thanks, Panel 3.
Excellent. All right, great. Well, not seeing any other hands, I'm going to close out the meeting. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it so much. And I'm sure there'll be follow-up conversations and work. So thanks so much for coming tonight. Have a great night.